In the heart of Mississippi, there was a small town called Oak Ridge. It wasn't the kind of place you'd find on postcards or travel guides. There were no towering skyscrapers, no bustling city streets, and no grand landmarks to speak of. Instead, it was filled with quiet neighborhoods, dusty roads, and people who knew each other by name. Life in Oak Ridge moved at its own slow pace, unbothered by the chaos of the outside world. But beneath this calm exterior lay secrets that simmered quietly until one day they erupted into something no one saw coming. At the center of this story was Officer Raymond Haskins, a man whose presence commanded respect, or fear, depending on who you asked. He had been patrolling the streets of Oak Ridge for over 20 years. To some, he was a symbol of authority, someone who kept the peace and upheld the law. To others, however, he was something else entirely, a racist cop with a badge and a chip on his shoulder. His reputation wasn't hidden. Everyone knew about it. Locals whispered behind closed doors about how Haskins treated black residents differently. They talked about how he would pull them over for minor infractions, or sometimes for no reason at all, and how his tone always carried an edge when speaking to them. But what made Haskins truly dangerous wasn't just his prejudice. It was the power he held as a police officer. In a town like Oak Ridge, where most people avoided confrontation, few dared to challenge him. Those who tried often found themselves facing fines, warnings, or worse. Over time, Haskins became untouchable, convinced that his position gave him immunity from accountability. And so, he continued doing things his way, never questioning whether he was right or wrong. On a sunny afternoon in late spring, everything seemed normal in Oak Ridge. The air was warm, the sky clear, and the streets relatively empty. Most folks were either at work or home preparing lunch. Officer Haskins sat in his patrol car near the edge of town, sipping coffee from a thermos and scanning the horizon lazily. He didn't expect much excitement today. It was just another ordinary shift. But fate has a funny way of turning ordinary days upside down. That's when he spotted a black sedan approaching from the distance. The driver appeared to be speeding slightly, though not egregiously enough to warrant serious concern. Still, Haskins decided to pull the car over. As the sedan slowed down and came to a stop by the side of the road, he stepped out of his vehicle, adjusted his hat, and walked toward the driver's window with a clipboard in hand. The man behind the wheel introduced himself as Marcus Johnson. He was young, clean-shaven, and dressed casually in jeans and a t-shirt. His demeanor was calm, almost too calm for someone being pulled over by the police. When Haskins asked for his license and registration, Marcus complied without hesitation, handing over the requested documents while explaining that he might have been driving a little fast, but hadn't realized it. What Haskins didn't know yet, and what Marcus hadn't mentioned, was that this wasn't just any ordinary citizen sitting in front of him. Marcus was a veteran, freshly returned from Afghanistan after serving 5 years in the U.S. Army. During his time overseas, he had earned multiple commendations for bravery and leadership under fire. He had faced bullets, bombs, and unimaginable hardships all in service to his country. Now, back home in Oak Ridge, he simply wanted to settle into a peaceful life. Little did he know that his first encounter with local law enforcement would turn into a nightmare. As Haskins examined Marcus's papers, something about the situation rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe it was Marcus's composed attitude which struck Haskins as disrespectful. Or maybe it was the color of Marcus's skin, which triggered prejudices buried deep within him. Whatever the reason, Haskins's mood shifted noticeably. His voice grew colder, sharper as he began peppering Marcus with questions. Why was he driving so fast? Where was he headed? Did he have anything illegal in the car? Marcus answered politely, trying to keep the interaction civil. But Haskins wasn't satisfied. Something inside him snapped, and before long, he ordered Marcus to step out of the vehicle. Confused but compliant, Marcus opened the door and stood beside his car. That's when things took a darker turn. Without warning, Haskins grabbed Marcus's arm, twisted it behind his back, and shoved him roughly against the hood of the sedan. Handcuffs clicked into place around Marcus's wrists, as Haskins barked accusations and hurled racial slurs loud, enough for anyone nearby to hear. Unbeknownst to both men, their actions were being recorded. A security camera mounted outside a convenience store across the street captured every moment of the altercation. From the initial traffic stop to the violent escalation, nothing escaped its lens. At the time, neither Marcus nor Haskins paid any attention to the camera. They were too caught up in the intensity of the moment. But later that footage would become the spark that ignited a firestorm. For Marcus, the experience was surreal. Here he was, a decorated soldier who had risked his life for his country, being treated like a criminal in his own hometown. The irony wasn't lost on him, but anger wasn't the emotion that consumed him. Instead, he felt sadness. Sadness for the state of the world he had fought to protect. Sadness for the fact that his uniform and medals meant nothing to someone, like Haskins. And sadness for the countless others who had likely endured similar treatment because of the color of their skin. Meanwhile, Haskins returned to his patrol car, seemingly unfazed by what had just transpired. To him, it was just another day on the job, another routine traffic stop turned slightly messy. He didn't realize that his actions had set off a chain reaction, one that would soon spiral far beyond the borders of Oak Ridge. For now, though, life in the small Mississippi town appeared unchanged. The sun continued shining, the birds kept chirping, and the streets remained quiet. But appearances can be deceiving. Beneath the surface, tensions were rising. The video of Marcus's arrest leaked online within hours, spreading like wildfire across social media platforms. People watched in disbelief, their outrage growing with each passing minute. Veterans, groups mobilized demanding justice for Marcus and accountability for Haskins. Civil rights organizations joined the chorus, pointing out the systemic racism embedded in institutions like law enforcement. Even ordinary citizens, many of whom had never met Marcus or heard of Oak Ridge, chimed in with messages of support, and then something extraordinary happened. News of the incident reached Washington, D.C., landing squarely on the desk of General Laura Simmons, a high-ranking official at the Pentagon. What she saw in that video shook her to her core. Not only was it a blatant act of racism, but it was also an affront to every service member who had ever worn the uniform. Simmons knew she couldn't stay silent. This wasn't just about Marcus. It was about sending a message to the entire nation. No one, not even a police officer, was above the law. Thus began a series high-ranking officials convene. The security camera outside the convenience store wasn't anything special. It was just a small, unassuming device mounted on the wall, installed by the owner to deter shoplifters and vandals. No one had expected it to capture something that would shake an entire nation. But as fate would have it, the lens of that camera framed every second of Officer Raymond Haskins' violent encounter with Marcus Johnson. When the footage was uploaded online later that evening, it didn't take long for the world to react. It started innocently enough. A teenager named Jamal, who worked part-time at the convenience store, noticed the video while reviewing the day's recordings. At first, he thought it was just another routine traffic stop, something he'd seen countless times before in Oak Ridge. But then he saw the handcuffs, heard the racial slurs, and watched as Marcus was slammed against his car. Shocked and angry, Jamal decided to share the clip on social media. Within minutes, it began spreading like wildfire. By midnight, the video had been viewed thousands of times. Comments poured in from people across the country, many expressing outrage over what they had witnessed. Some called for immediate action against Officer Haskins, while others shared their own stories of mistreatment at the hands of law enforcement. Hashtags like "Yard Justice for Marcus" and "No More Racism in Blue" trended on Twitter, drawing even more attention to the incident. What had started as a local issue in a small Mississippi town quickly became a national conversation. Among those watching the video was General Laura Simmons, a decorated military leader stationed at the Pentagon. She sat in her office late that night, scrolling through reports and updates when she stumbled upon the footage. Her heart sank as she watched the scene unfold. Here was a young man, a veteran, who had sacrificed years of his life serving his country, only to be treated like a criminal in broad daylight. The injustice of it hit her hard. not just as a human being, but as someone who had dedicated her career to protecting the values America stood for. Simmons couldn't sleep after seeing the video. She replayed it several times, each viewing fueling her determination to act. By morning, she had drafted a proposal and called an emergency meeting with other high-ranking officials at the Pentagon. "This isn't just about one officer or one town," she told them. "It's about sending a message that we will not tolerate racism, especially when it targets our service members. We owe it to Marcus, and to every veteran, to stand up." The room fell silent as Simmons outlined her plan. She proposed launching a full-scale investigation into the incident, working closely with federal agencies to ensure accountability. More importantly, she suggested using the case as a catalyst for broader reforms within law enforcement. The idea was bold, unprecedented even, but the other officials agreed unanimously. This wasn't just about punishing Officer Haskins. It was about addressing systemic issues that had plagued policing for decades. While the Pentagon prepared its response, Marcus found himself thrust into the spotlight. Reporters camped outside his modest home, eager to hear his side of the story. Friends and strangers alike reached out, offering words of encouragement and support. For Marcus, though, the sudden attention was overwhelming. He hadn't asked for any of this. All he wanted was to live a quiet life after returning from Afghanistan. Now his face was everywhere, and his name was synonymous with a fight much bigger than himself. Despite the chaos, Marcus remained composed. With the help of veteran advocacy groups, he hired a lawyer named Sarah Bennett, a seasoned civil rights attorney known for taking on high-profile cases. Together, they filed a lawsuit against Officer Haskins and the Oak Ridge Police Department, accusing them of excessive force, racial profiling, and violating Marcus's constitutional rights. The legal battle promised to be long and grueling, but Marcus knew it was necessary, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of discrimination. Back in Oak Ridge, tensions were rising. Locals gathered in coffee shops and diners debating the incident and its implications. Some defended Haskins, claiming he was simply doing his job. Others condemned his actions, calling for his immediate dismissal. The divide reflected a larger national debate about race, policing, and justice. Meanwhile, protests began cropping up around town, organized by activists determined to keep the pressure on local authorities. Signs reading "Black Lives Matter" and "Protect Our Heroes" lined the streets, while chants echoed through the air. Officer Haskins, for his part, seemed oblivious to the storm brewing around him. When questioned by internal affairs investigators, he insisted he had done nothing wrong. According to him, Marcus had been disrespectful and uncooperative, leaving him no choice but to escalate the situation. His colleagues, however, weren't so sure. Several officers privately admitted to witnessing similar behavior from Haskins in the past, but had stayed silent out of fear of retaliation. Now, faced with mounting evidence, some began reconsidering their loyalty to him. As news of the Pentagon's involvement spread, the stakes grew higher. Politicians weighed in, with some praising the move as a step toward accountability, and others criticizing it as government overreach. Talk shows and opinion columns dissected every detail of the case, turning it into a cultural phenomenon. Even international media outlets picked up the story, framing it as an example of America's ongoing struggle with racial inequality. For Marcus, the whirlwind of attention brought both challenges and opportunities. On one hand, he struggled to adjust to his newfound fame. Simple tasks like grocery shopping or visiting friends became complicated due to the constant presence of reporters and supporters. On the other hand, he recognized the platform he now had. Determined to make a difference, he began speaking publicly about his experiences, sharing his story at rallies and community meetings. His calm demeanor and heartfelt speeches resonated with audiences, inspiring many to join the fight for change. One particularly memorable moment came during a televised interview. When asked how he felt about the incident, Marcus paused for a moment before responding. "I'm angry," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But I'm not angry at Officer Haskins. I'm angry at a system that allows people like him to abuse their power without consequence. I served my country because I believed in its promise of freedom and equality. And now, I want to help fulfill that promise. For myself, for my brothers and sisters in uniform, and for anyone who has ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. His words struck a chord, amplifying the movement sparked by the video. Across the country, people rallied behind Marcus, organizing marches, signing petitions, and demanding reforms. Schools incorporated discussions about racial bias into their curriculums, while corporations pledged millions to support diversity initiatives. The ripple effects of that single traffic stop continued to grow, touching lives far beyond Oak Ridge. Meanwhile, General Simmons and her team worked tirelessly behind the scenes. They coordinated with lawmakers to draft legislation aimed at addressing racial bias in policing, ensuring that incidents like Marcus's wouldn't happen again. They also partnered with advocacy groups to create training programs designed to educate officers about implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. Though progress was slow, Simmons remained optimistic. She knew that real change took time, but she also knew that moments like these, the ones that galvanized entire nations, were rare and precious. As draws to a close, the stage is set for a dramatic showdown. The lawsuit against Officer Haskins looms large, promising to expose uncomfortable truths about policing in America. Protests continue to gain momentum, fueled by Marcus's courage and the Pentagon's unwavering support. And somewhere in the midst of it all, a small Mississippi town finds itself at the center of a movement that refuses to back down. The question remains, will justice prevail, or will the forces of prejudice and privilege prove too powerful to overcome? The trial of Officer Raymond Haskins began on a crisp autumn morning, and it felt like the entire country was holding its breath. Courtrooms are usually quiet, orderly spaces where justice unfolds methodically, but this one was different. Reporters packed the benches, their cameras clicking incessantly. Protesters gathered outside, chanting slogans and holding signs that read, "Justice for Marcus" and "End Police Racism." Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Everyone knew this wasn't just about one man. It was about accountability, fairness, and whether the system could deliver justice when it mattered most. Marcus Johnson sat stoically beside his lawyer, Sarah Bennett, as the proceedings got underway. He wore a suit borrowed from a friend, his posture straight and dignified. Despite the chaos surrounding him, he exuded calmness, almost as if he had accepted whatever outcome lay ahead. For Marcus, this wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about standing up for what was right. Beside him, Sarah flipped through her notes, her sharp eyes scanning the courtroom. She had spent months preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and strategizing every possible angle. This case wasn't just another job for her. It was personal. On the other side of the aisle sat Officer Haskins, flanked by his defense attorney, a seasoned litigator named Charles Grayson. Unlike Marcus, Haskins looked uneasy, shifting in his seat and avoiding eye contact with the spectators. His once confident demeanor seemed to have crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny. Grayson, however, remained composed, projecting an aura of confidence despite knowing the uphill battle they faced. He had crafted a defense centered around the argument that Haskins had acted within protocol and that Marcus's behavior during the traffic stop justified the use of force. But even Grayson couldn't ignore the mountain of evidence stacked against them. The prosecution opened its case with a bang. They played the now infamous video footage from the convenience store camera, showing Haskins slamming Marcus against his car and shouting racial slurs. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as jurors watched the scene unfold. It was impossible to deny the brutality captured on tape, and the prosecution wasted no time driving the point home. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Sarah began in her opening statement, "this is not just about one bad apple. This is about a pattern of abuse, a culture of impunity, and a failure to protect those who serve our nation." Over the next several days, witness after witness took the stand, each adding another layer to the damning narrative against Haskins. Fellow officers testified about his history of discriminatory behavior, recounting incidents where he had targeted black residents without cause. One officer admitted that he had often felt uncomfortable working alongside Haskins, but feared speaking out due to potential retaliation. Another described how Haskins would make racially charged jokes during briefings, laughing off complaints when confronted. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from veterans who had served alongside Marcus in Afghanistan. They spoke passionately about his character, describing him as a brave and selfless leader who put others before himself. Their words painted a stark contrast between the honorable soldier Marcus was and the way he had been treated upon returning home. "Marcus didn't deserve this," said one veteran, his voice trembling with emotion. "He gave 5 years of his life to protect us, and this is how we repay him, by letting someone like Haskins humiliate him because of the color of his skin." As the trial progressed, expert witnesses were called to shed light on the broader implications of the case. Psychologists explained the psychological toll such encounters take on veterans, particularly those struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. Sociologists discussed systemic racism within law enforcement, highlighting statistics that showed disproportionate rates of police violence against people of color. Each piece of testimony added fuel to the fire, making it increasingly difficult for Haskins's defense team to mount a convincing counterargument. Grayson tried his best, though. He cross-examined witnesses aggressively, attempting to poke holes in their stories. He argued that the video didn't tell the full story, suggesting that Marcus might have provoked Haskins in some way. But his efforts fell flat. The more he pushed back, the more desperate his argument sounded. Even members of the jury exchanged skeptical glances, clearly unimpressed by the defense's attempts to justify Haskins's actions. Outside the courtroom, the movement continued to gain momentum. Protests spread to cities across the country, with thousands marching in solidarity with Marcus. Veteran organizations held rallies, demanding reforms to ensure that service members wouldn't face discrimination upon returning home. Politicians scrambled to respond, introducing bills aimed at addressing racial bias in policing. Meanwhile, General Laura Simmons remained a steady presence in Washington, D.C., coordinating efforts with lawmakers and advocacy groups to push for meaningful change. Back in Oak Ridge, the trial dominated local conversations. Residents debated passionately, some doubling down in support of Haskins, while others expressed shame over the town's association with him. Local businesses displayed signs supporting Marcus, and schools organized assemblies to discuss issues of race and justice. The trial had become a mirror reflecting society's deepest flaws and its greatest hopes. As closing arguments approached, tensions reached a fever pitch. Sarah delivered a powerful summation, urging the jury to see beyond the individual case and recognize the larger moral imperative at stake. "This isn't just about convicting Officer Haskins," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "It's about sending a message to every police officer, every citizen, and every veteran that discrimination will not be tolerated. Justice isn't blind. It sees everything, and today, it must act." When the jury finally retired to deliberate, the wait felt endless. Hours stretched into days as the nation held its collective breath. Finally, after 3 agonizing days, the verdict was announced. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman stood to read the decision, guilty on all counts. Cheers erupted outside, echoing through the streets as news of the verdict spread. For Marcus, it was a bittersweet victory. He had won, yes, but the scars of that day would never fully heal. For Officer Haskins, the verdict marked the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with consequences for his actions. He was sentenced to prison and stripped of his badge, a symbol of authority he had wielded recklessly. But the real impact of the trial extended far beyond the courtroom. Inspired by the case, Congress passed sweeping reforms aimed at addressing racial bias in law enforcement nationwide. Training programs were implemented, oversight committees established, and policies rewritten to ensure greater accountability. Marcus, for his part, found solace in the knowledge that his ordeal had sparked a movement. Determined to keep fighting, he dedicated his post-military career to mentoring young veterans and advocating for change. Though the road ahead remained challenging, He walked it with renewed purpose, knowing he had made a difference, not just for himself, but for countless others who had yet to find their voice. The guilty verdict against Officer Raymond Haskins sent shockwaves across the nation. It wasn't just a courtroom victory. It was a symbolic triumph for anyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. For Marcus Johnson, the decision brought a mix of emotions. Relief washed over him as he realized that his fight had not been in vain. Yet beneath the surface, there lingered a deep sadness. He knew that while this case had ended, countless others like it were still unfolding, every day in towns and cities across America. Justice had been served, but the work was far from over. In Oak Ridge, life began to change in unexpected ways. The trial had cast a harsh spotlight on the town's police department, forcing local authorities to confront long-ignored issues within their ranks. Officers attended mandatory training sessions on racial bias and de-escalation techniques, many of them reluctantly at first. But as weeks turned into months, attitudes slowly shifted. Some officers admitted they hadn't fully understood the impact of their actions until hearing firsthand accounts during the trial. Others began speaking out about the need for reform, realizing that silence only perpetuated the problem. Meanwhile, protests continued to ripple through the country, fueled by the momentum of Marcus's case. What started as a local outcry in Mississippi had grown into a national movement. Veterans groups played a pivotal role, organizing marches and rallies under banners like "Protect Our Heroes" and "Justice for All." These events weren't just about raising awareness, they were calls to action. Speakers urged attendees to contact lawmakers, support advocacy organizations, and hold law enforcement accountable in their own communities. The message was clear. Marcus's story was a starting point, not an end point. General Laura Simmons remained deeply involved, using her position at the Pentagon to push for systemic change. She worked tirelessly with legislators to draft bills aimed at addressing racial disparities in policing. One of the most significant pieces of legislation introduced during this time was the Veterans Protection Act, which mandated stricter oversight of law enforcement agencies and provided resources for veterans facing discrimination. Simmons also spearheaded initiatives to improve relations between the military and civilian law enforcement, emphasizing mutual respect and shared responsibility. But perhaps the most profound transformation occurred within Marcus himself. The months following the trial, he emerged as a reluctant yet powerful voice for change. At first, he resisted the idea of becoming a public figure, preferring to live quietly and focus on rebuilding his life. However, the overwhelming support he received and the realization of how much his story resonated with others convinced him to step forward. He began traveling across the country, sharing his experiences at schools, community centers, and conferences. His speeches were simple yet impactful, blending personal anecdotes with calls for unity and understanding. One of Marcus's most memorable appearances took place at a large rally in Washington, D.C., where thousands gathered to demand justice for marginalized communities. Standing on stage, he looked out at the sea of faces before him and spoke from the heart. "I didn't ask for this," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "No one should have to go through what I went through. But if my pain can help someone else avoid suffering, then it's worth it. We're stronger together than we are apart, and together, we can create a world where no one is judged by the color of their skin or treated unfairly because of who they are." His words struck a chord, inspiring many to join the movement. People of all ages, races, and backgrounds came together, united by a common goal: to build a fairer, more equitable society. Social media campaigns gained traction, encouraging users to share stories of resilience and solidarity. Artists created murals honoring Marcus and other victims of racial injustice, turning city walls into canvases of hope. Musicians wrote songs inspired by the struggle, their lyrics echoing themes of courage and perseverance. As the movement grew, so did its influence. Corporations took notice, pledging millions to fund diversity programs and scholarships for underrepresented groups. Schools incorporated lessons on racial equality and civic responsibility into their curriculums, ensuring that future generations would learn from the mistakes of the past. Even Hollywood got involved, producing documentaries and films based on real-life stories of discrimination and triumph. These efforts helped keep the conversation alive, reminding people that progress required constant vigilance. Back in Oak Ridge, the changes were visible but not without resistance. Some residents grumbled about the new policies, accusing officials of bowing to political correctness. A few even defended Haskins privately, claiming he had been made a scapegoat. But these voices grew quieter as the benefits of reform became apparent. Crime rates dropped, trust between citizens and police improved, and the town began attracting visitors curious about its role in sparking a nationwide awakening. For Marcus, returning to Oak Ridge after months on the road felt surreal. The quiet, streets and familiar landmarks brought back memories both painful and hopeful. He reconnected with old friends and neighbors, many of whom thanked him for bringing attention to issues they had long ignored. Though he appreciated their gratitude, Marcus reminded everyone that the credit belonged to the collective effort of those who had stood up and spoken out. Determined to leave a lasting legacy, Marcus founded a non-profit organization called Heroes Without Borders. Its mission was twofold: to provide mentorship and resources for veterans transitioning to civilian life, and to advocate for policies promoting racial equity. Within months, the organization gained widespread support, partnering with veteran groups, civil rights advocates, and educational institutions to expand its reach. Marcus threw himself into the work wholeheartedly, finding purpose in helping others navigate challenges similar to his own. Despite the progress, setbacks were inevitable. Not every proposed reform passed Congress, and not every protest led to immediate results. Critics argued that the movement lacked direction or accused activists of being overly ambitious, but Marcus refused to let negativity derail the momentum. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he often said. "It takes time, patience, and persistence. We've come too far to give up now." Years passed since the trial that shook Oak Ridge and the nation, but its impact lingered like ripples in a pond. The case of Marcus Johnson versus Officer Raymond Haskins became more than just a legal battle. It was etched into history as a turning point, a moment when ordinary people stood up to demand justice and accountability. For Marcus, life had transformed in ways he never imagined. He wasn't just a veteran or a victim anymore. He was a symbol of resilience, a leader whose story inspired countless others to fight for what was right. Heroes Without Borders, the nonprofit Marcus founded, flourished under his leadership. What began as a small initiative grew into a nationwide movement, with chapters in cities across America. The organization provided mentorship programs for veterans, helping them adjust to civilian life while addressing issues like discrimination and mental health. It also partnered with schools, businesses, and law enforcement agencies to promote diversity and inclusion. Through workshops, seminars, and community outreach, Heroes Without Borders became a beacon of hope, not just for veterans, but for anyone striving to create a fairer world. Marcus's work earned him recognition far beyond Oak Ridge. He received awards and honors, including a prestigious humanitarian medal presented by General Laura Simmons at a ceremony in Washington, D.C. As they stood together on stage, Marcus reflected on how far they'd come since the Pentagon first intervened in his case. "This isn't about me," he said humbly during his acceptance speech. "It's about all of us, every person who has ever felt invisible, every voice that has been silenced, every dream that has been deferred. We are building a future where no one is left behind." But Marcus's journey wasn't without challenges. There were days when the weight of responsibility felt overwhelming, when the memories of that fateful traffic stop resurfaced unbidden. On those nights, he would sit alone in his living room, staring at the framed commendations hanging on his wall. They reminded him of why he kept going, the promise he had made to himself and to others that his pain wouldn't be wasted. Slowly, he learned to channel those emotions into fuel for his mission, finding strength in the knowledge that he was making a difference. Back in Oak Ridge, the town had undergone a remarkable transformation. Once known only for its quiet streets and sleepy charm, It now attracted visitors eager to learn about its role in sparking a national movement. Local leaders worked hard to ensure that progress continued, implementing policies that prioritized transparency and accountability within law enforcement. New officers joined the police force, trained not only in tactical skills but also in empathy and cultural sensitivity. Community policing initiatives brought residents and officers closer together, fostering trust where there had once been fear. Protests and rallies eventually gave way to quieter forms of activism, but the spirit of the movement remained alive. Schools taught students about Marcus's story, using it as an example of courage and perseverance. Artists painted murals celebrating diversity, while musicians composed songs that captured the essence of unity. Even corporations played their part, adopting practices that promoted equity and fairness in the workplace. The changes weren't perfect, they never are, but they represented steps in the right direction. For General Laura Simmons, the success of the movement validated her belief in the power of collective action. She retired from the Pentagon after decades of service, leaving behind a legacy of advocacy and reform. Her efforts to address systemic racism in law enforcement paved the way for lasting change, earning her widespread admiration. In retirement, she dedicated herself to mentoring young leaders, encouraging them to carry the torch forward. "The fight doesn't end with us," she often said. "It's up to the next generation to keep pushing boundaries and breaking barriers." As for Officer Raymond Haskins, his name faded into obscurity. After serving his prison sentence, he disappeared from public view, unable, or unwilling, to face the world he had once tried to control. Some speculated that he lived out his days, filled with regret, while others believed he remained unchanged, convinced he had done nothing wrong. Either way, his actions served as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the consequences of prejudice and unchecked power. Decades later, historians looked back on this period as a defining moment in American history. Books were written, documentaries produced, and memorials erected to honor those who had fought for justice. Marcus's story was told and retold, inspiring new generations to stand up against inequality wherever they found it. His name became synonymous with courage and determination, a testament to the idea that one person truly could make a difference. In his later years, Marcus returned to Oak Ridge, content to live a simpler life surrounded by family and friends. Though his hair had turned gray and his body bore the marks of age, his spirit remained as strong as ever. He spent his days gardening, reading, and occasionally speaking at local events. Children in the neighborhood adored him, flocking to hear his stories of bravery and resilience. To them, he wasn't just a hero, he was proof that even in the darkest times, light could prevail. One summer evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus sat on his porch, watching fireflies dance in the twilight. Beside him sat Sarah Bennett, his lawyer-turned-friend, sipping lemonade and reminiscing about the early days of the trial. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" she asked softly. Marcus smiled, his eyes reflecting the warm glow of the setting sun. "All the time," he replied. "But I try not to dwell on what-ifs. What matters is what we did with what happened. We turned pain into purpose, anger into action. And because of that, the world is a little better today than it was yesterday." Sarah nodded, raising her glass in a silent toast. As the stars began to twinkle above, Marcus leaned back in his chair, feeling a deep sense of peace. He knew the fight for equality would continue long after he was gone, carried forward by those who refused to settle for less than justice. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of gratitude for the support he'd received, for the lives he'd touched, and for the chance to leave behind a legacy worth remembering. And so, the story of Marcus Johnson came full circle, from a quiet town in Mississippi to the halls of Congress, from a single act of injustice to a nationwide awakening. His journey proved that change was possible when people dared to dream of something greater. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't quick, but it was worth every step. In the end, Marcus didn't just win a court case. He helped rewrite the rules of a flawed system, proving that even the smallest voices can spark the biggest revolutions.